We're glad to have Dr. Buckley here again with us to talk about the Civil War or the Uncivil War in the American West. Dr. J. Buckley joined the BYU history faculty in the fall of 2001. He teaches American West and American Indian history courses and directs the Native American Studies minor. His specialties include Lewis and Clark, exploration and migration, Indian-white relations, fur trade, and other Western themes. Dr. Buckley's publications include William Clark, Indian Diplomat, By His Own Hand, The Mysterious Death of Meriwether Lewis, Zebulon Pike, Thomas Jefferson, and the Opening of the American West. The recipient of the Charles Redd Center's Molly and Carl G. Butler Young Scholar Award in Western Studies, Dr. Buckley currently serves as president of the Lewis and Clark Trail Heritage Foundation, which provides national leadership in scholarship, education, and conservation pertaining to the Lewis and Clark National Historic Trail. In 2010, the foundation awarded Dr. Buckley a Meritorious Achievement Award for his Lewis and Clark scholarship. Jay and his wife, Becky, are the parents of 3 children, and are all 3 of them here today? Just the oldest, okay. Well, welcome. And we welcome all of you for this session of lectures on the Civil War, and we welcome Dr. Buckley and wish him, give him a warm welcome to be here.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for coming to spend this hour together. I'm grateful to the library for inviting me to speak as part of their Voices of the Civil War House of Learning lecture. And if you'll go over to that display, you'll notice that there are several themes therein. One is about the abolitionist movement, and we're going to talk a little bit today about some of the abolitionists in the West. The effects on families are noted, and we're going to look at how families, particularly those in the American West, are impacted by the Civil War. They have a series of lantern slides that provide little snapshots of the war, and throughout my lecture, I'm going to give you some snapshots around the West, indicating some of the things that transpired there. And finally, they have an echoes of the past, and I'd like you to think about the ways in which historical memory and meaning are conveyed. If I had to ask you in the audience by a show of hands, how many of you could name more than 3 or 4 battles that occurred in the American West? Let's see a show of hands. All right, it's a fairly small number, suffice it to say. But you may be surprised that, well, before we get to that slide, just a little background on where we're headed today. I want to talk a little bit about how the American West served as a prelude to the war, discuss about the uncivilness in the West, particularly pertaining to guerrilla warfare, mass executions, the blue, the gray, and the red troops involved, internment and death marches, militias, and massacres. Aren't you glad this is after dinner, right? And we'll also talk about Reconstruction, Western style, as the roundup. As a prelude to the war, Texas statehood in 1845 set the country on a course for troubles with our neighbors to the south. This will culminate in the Mexican-American War. During the Mexican-American War and the discussions thereof, David Wilmot will entertain a motion to try to prevent slavery from being extended to any areas that may be obtained during the war. This had been something that had happened with the Northwest Ordinance in the early part of our nation's history. It had been considered again during the Louisiana Purchase. And here again, with another major expansion, the question of slavery, and more particularly its extension into the territories, became front and center. Then the gold rush era of the 1840s is going to launch a series or string of immigrants who travel both overland and by sea to settle in California. And by 1850, over 300,000 Americans are in California clamoring for statehood. With this will come the Compromise of 1850, which admits California to the Union as a free state. This was a major difference because up until this point, from 1820 to 1850, whenever a new territory came into statehood, the Congress was careful to balance the free and slave states. And in 1849, there were an equal number of free and slave states, but after 1850, there will be more free states than slave states. It's going to be an ongoing battle. To get the South to agree, they passed the Fugitive Slave Law. They entertained notions of popular sovereignty in the territories and other kinds of things. But this was a big change. And then in 1854, a major event happens. The Nebraska-Kansas Act is passed. You may see it as the Kansas-Nebraska Act, but it's actually in code as the Nebraska-Kansas. And this unleashes a string of bloodshed and terror on the Great Plains. It also takes the northern two-thirds of the permanent Indian territory that had been created by the Indian Removal Act of 1830. And this, too, is going to come to play a major role during the Civil War. In 1857, there's a Supreme Court case about Dred Scott and some of his travels into free territories and free states, and whether or not, upon the death of his master, he could sue for his freedom. His wife, Harriet, actually had a stronger case because she was from Pennsylvania and they had a gradual manumission law, but they decided to go with Dred's, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. At the conclusion of these two decisions, the Nebraska-Kansas Act and the Supreme Court decision of Dred Scott, it became clear that the slavery issue was coming to the fore. Not only did the Nebraska-Kansas Act repeal the Missouri Compromise that had precluded slavery from being extended to the west above the 3630 parallel, but now the decision by Chief Justice Taney was going to have serious ramifications. This led to a number of abolitionists, particularly those in Kansas and Missouri, who tried to get as many settlers to their areas as they could so that they could, through popular sovereignty, declare their territories as free or slave. And it's going to lead to a man named John Brown, who leads a messianic push to make abolition his creed, and will eventually die as either a zealot or a martyr, depending on your viewpoint. The question I asked earlier, how many of you could name more than one or two battles in the West, will probably be surprised by how many incidences there are. These are just some of the battles that I chronicled that occurred in the American West, which I define as west of the Mississippi River for this lecture's purposes. You can see that in particular there are several clumpings of battles, particularly those in Missouri, Kansas, Indian Territory, and Arkansas. There's also a series of battles in New Mexico, which are going to play an important role. And there's also some sporadic ones scattered about in Colorado, Idaho, and the Dakotas that will also be during the Civil War period. And even though the blue and red states have somewhat switched politically, you can see that in the 1860 election, this was a contested debate that was dividing the nation apart. Well, as the war broke out, people that were living in the plains found out that Kansas was still bleeding. The war that had erupted in 1855 and 56 with the Potawatomi massacres, with John Brown's raids, with bushwhacker reprisals, began to continue to spill out. And one of the major wars of the 1860s was to control the strategic state of Missouri. This had access to both the Ohio, the Mississippi, and Missouri rivers, making it a vital state for strategy purposes. As a result of this, there were a series of wars held within Missouri, Arkansas, Indian Territory, and Kansas. One of the initial ones was in Wilson's Creek, where the first brigadier general of the Union was killed, a General Nathaniel Lyon. Eventually, the Confederates will gain an upper hand, at least initially, and will take control of much of these areas. One of the advantages that they had is that the Confederates actively recruited Indians into their regiments. The Union did not do so until the end of 1862, beginning of 1863, because they didn't want any non-citizens to serve in the Army. So this was going to be a big change. In addition, the South also found a number of people in Missouri and elsewhere that were willing to fight a guerrilla warfare battle. These were not necessarily battles between soldiers, but any non-combatants or civilians were also fair game. Now this is going to come to a head because the two gentlemen you see here, the one on the left is a man named William Quantrell, and you may have heard of some of his activities. And one of his henchmen or riders was Bloody Bill Anderson, the man on the right. And they're going to have a very influential part in winning control of this area. One of the first things that Quantrell and Anderson do is they decide that they will have a no quarters regiment in terms of who they capture. What no quarter means is that there's no mercy and that those people are killed summarily and not necessarily taken as prisoners, which was common during the Civil War. So this no quartering is going to play a big difference, because when they sack Lawrence in 1863 and they kill the 20 soldiers stationed there, they make a decision to kill every adult male in the town. Then they kill most of the boys, and then they burn most of the homes. So this intense total warfare against individual communities, which the Confederates saw Lawrence as one of these bastions of abolitionist thought, and so they wanted to make a statement by burning the town. When the Union regained control, their general named Ewing issued General Order Number 11. Basically, it said anyone who was living in the Kansas City area needed to get into the city because all surrounding communities would be destroyed. And all of the 4 counties bordering between Kansas and Missouri would also be put to the torch. So they had 2 weeks where they could move, and then the troops went and reprised against western Missouri. Of course, this didn't go over well with the bushwhackers, and so they retaliated by murdering 100 prisoners that they had captured. And this fighting back and forth is going to continue in the Kansas and Missouri area. The second phase of the uncivil war in the West had to do with Indian Territory. You'll notice that these recruits that are signing up for service, we've got a federal troop on the left and a Confederate on the right. The Confederates had the upper hand throughout the early part of the war. They controlled most of this region, and most of the 5 tribes that had removed to Indian Territory, or modern-day Oklahoma, chose to fight with the Confederacy, although there were several nations who had split allegiances. One of those in particular was the Cherokee Nation. The Cherokees had been deeply divided since the 1830s, when they were forcibly removed from their homes in Georgia and the Carolinas. One of the frictions was between those Indians who had signed the Treaty of New Echota in 1835 and then had peaceably removed to Oklahoma, and the majority of the nation who sided with John Ross and decided to stay and fight the removal order through the Supreme Courts. And you know some of the court decisions and the ramifications of those. But eventually, the majority of the tribe will be removed, and they will end up in the same place in Indian Territory. And there will be a bitter feud that goes on between those who signed the treaty and those that were opposed to it. Those wounds are opened afresh during the Civil War, and even though John Ross tries to maintain neutrality, his nemesis, Stand Watie, joins the Confederacy and forms the Cherokee Mounted Rifle Regiment, or the Cherokee Braves. You see their regimental flag there. And they will be a very successful arm of the Confederate advance. I like this image because it shows that some of these Civil War battles, like the one in Pea Ridge, Arkansas, had Indian combatants. Now, even though the Cherokee did not wear long headdresses, as you see in the bottom right, it does give an indication that these Indian warriors had quite a presence. And indeed, when you read the accounts of the Union soldiers of hearing the Indian rebel yell, and then hearing about some of the scalping and mutilation that occurs after these battles, it did put some fear into the Union troops. To the north, in the Dakotas, the Civil War had disrupted the Army's and government's desire to remove Indians to reservations. And even though some nations had already removed to reservations, the supply lines and annuities were severely disrupted during the war. In 1862, on the Santee Sioux Reservation in Minnesota, they were having difficulty and were starving to death. When they petitioned the agent and said, "When are we going to receive our rations?" he said something to the effect of, "Why don't you eat grass?" This didn't go over well, even though some of the older diplomats tried to maintain peace. The young warriors were furious, and they exacted their revenge. They began striking communities. They attacked Fort Ridgely. And there's a series of skirmishes throughout the 1860s in the Dakotas. Eventually, Governor Sibley will call out the state volunteers or militia, and they will try to put down the Santee Uprising, as it was called. Now, one of the tribal leaders was named Little Crow. You see that he had a wanted poster made after him. And eventually, after a series of skirmishes in 1862 and 63, the uprising is put down, and 308 Santee are charged with execution. Now, Abraham Lincoln decided to commute a number of those, but they still hung 38 Santee in one of the largest mass hangings in American history. In New Mexico, the Texans had one of the largest numbers of volunteers that agreed to serve in the war. And their plan was to take the mineral-rich areas of Colorado and California. They initially wanted to control New Mexico so that they could control Santa Fe and overland trails. And they were making a move on Fort Union, which was the last federally held fort. If you see that bottom map with the green, you can see that the bottom part of New Mexico and part of modern-day Arizona had seceded in January of 1862 and formed a Confederate territory. And so the Texans moved in force and began moving up the Rio Grande Valley. They quickly captured Valverde and Albuquerque and Santa Fe without much difficulty. Those that were at Fort Union were noticeably worried with 3,000 Confederate troops moving upstream. They called around to surrounding territories to see if they could supply reinforcements, and Colorado answered the call and sent some volunteers down to assist them. California also sent volunteers, but they will arrive after the incidences are over. Now, one of the Colorado leaders was a man named John Shivington. He's pictured here on the right next to a Mr. Slow. And they will be the principal leaders of the Union defense. Before the Confederates advanced into Fort Union, they had to pass through the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. And there at Glorieta Pass, they met with the Colorado Volunteers. Shivington led about 400 men in a surprise assault on their rear to destroy their pack train. He did a heroic effort of getting his men down a very steep cliff. They burned a number of wagons. They destroyed or used ammunition. They shot the horses and mules. They burned the clothing and food. They pretty much destroyed the entire supply train that the Texas Army was relying upon for their advance. So even though the Confederates won the battle in the front, after they got back, they saw that they could no longer do anything, and so they had to retreat back to Fort Bliss, Texas. Actually, quite a few more people died on their journey back to Texas than in the campaign. But this was a severe blow to the Confederacy because it stopped their western push and kept Colorado and California in Union hands. Another development occurred when the California Volunteers arrived in New Mexico. And one of the leaders, named Carleton, wanted to remove the Navajo from their sacred lands, or Deneta, the place where the Navajo call living among the people. And this is boundaried by 4 sacred mountains, which the Navajo are taught from when they were small to stay within, and they will be protected and watched over. Some of their leaders pictured here are Barboncito on the left and Manuelito on the right. And you see the beautiful valley of Canyon de Chelly. This is one of the sacred sites of the Navajo people, and for many is seen as their mother. This is the place they go for refuge and for succor. They also thought it was a place of great strength and stronghold, and that they would be able to defend themselves from any kind of attack. However, in July of 1863, Carleton issues an order that all Navajos who do not reply to an ultimatum will be captured, and a total warfare will be the result. This resulted in Kit Carson leading the New Mexican Mounted Volunteers to conduct the roundup. Their looting of the crops, they destroyed all the corn and the peach orchards and the wheat, shot the sheep and the horses and the other animals, and pretty much starved the Navajo into submission. After this point, over 9,000 Navajos are interred and sent on a forced death march about 400 miles to a place called Bosco Redondo on the Pecos River near Fort Sumner in New Mexico. So it was a time of horrific suffering. Along the journey, they were attacked by slave raiders from the Utes and the New Mexican colonies. Those that could not keep up were killed. There was rape and molestation of the women. There's stories of women having babies and leaving them under trees and rocks because they couldn't care for them and they were on this forced march. It's a really horrific period in Navajo history. Some still evaded the army and remained within the mountains, but about 9,000 removed on this long walk. Closer to home, a few hundred miles from here to the north, we had a major incident when the California Volunteers arrived in Utah Territory. In October of 1862, Patrick Edward Connor and the California Volunteers will build Camp Douglas, later named Fort Douglas, just 3 miles east of Salt Lake on the bench. And in the spring, his men were itching for a campaign. He'd already instituted a Cold War with Brigham Young and the Mormons, so he decided to start a hot war with the Shoshone and Bannocks. There had been some raiding along the overland trails, and one of his duties was to watch over and protect those trails. As a result, in January, he and several hundred men marched north in the bitter cold to find bear hunters' camp on the Bear River near Preston, Idaho. It was considered Utah territory at the time, and it wasn't until about a decade later till the surveys actually placed it in Idaho territory. He arrived in January at Bear Hunters Village. Some of Bear Hunters' band had been warned in a dream that this was going to occur, and so they had a debate, and some of them decided to leave, and the rest decided to stay and fight. So they were kind of waiting for some kind of event to occur, and Connor obliged. And in January of 1863, they're on the Bear River, and they have the Battle of Bear River, or the Bear River Massacre, in which over 300 men, women, and children are killed. Again, this is a high incident of non-combatants. About 2/3 of the deaths are women and children, which is different than the typical battles on the plains between regular forces and Indian soldiers. And then in 1864, the following year, a similar event will occur in Colorado. You recognize the gentleman on the left. This is John Shivington again, one of the heroes of Glorieta Pass. He was a 6'6" parson. Apparently he kept the pistol on the pulpit just to keep people awake during testimony meeting, I guess. But he didn't want a clergy commission in the war. He wanted a rank, or a brevet rank, as a militia. So he was a major and then a colonel. And just below him is Governor John Evans, the Colorado territorial governor, who had ambitions to be one of the first senators when Colorado became a state. One of the things that both of them agreed on was that the way to get more votes among the miners and settlers who'd moved into the area was to eradicate Indian peoples from the territorial boundaries. Well, you'll see that one of those groups living in eastern Colorado were the Southern Cheyenne. And they were very near an agency located at Fort Lyon. And the agent there was named Wyankoop. And you see him there in the center of the photograph with a hat on. Wyankoop was actually quite fond of the Cheyenne people, and he did much to try to protect them. And every time he got orders from the governor and from Shivington, he kept telling them, you'll have to go somewhere else because the Indians in my district are getting along fine and are doing exactly what we intend. In fact, Black Kettle had already taken some pressure because in 1861, he'd been one of the 6 chiefs to sign a treaty removing the Southern Cheyenne to a reservation. As an older man with a number of women and children to protect, he thought that this was the best avenue. The younger warriors and the dog soldiers had different plans, and they continued to raid on the trails and to take captives and raid communities. But nevertheless, because of the resistance of Wyankoop, he's transferred to another agency and replaced by another agent that does not have those personal connections. As soon as that's accomplished, Shivington and the bloodless third of the Colorado First Volunteers traveled down to Sand Creek in eastern Colorado, and in November of 1864, they attacked Black Kettle's village. Over Black Kettle's lodge is hanging an American flag he was given by President Lincoln. He and some of his men had traveled to Washington. They had pictures with President Lincoln and his wife Mary. Another one, White Antelope, had a truce flag flying over his lodge, which they had been told would protect them from harm. Well, the flags did little to protect them from the vengeance of Shivington, and they ravaged the village, killing 150 to 200 men, women, and children. Again, a high degree of non-combatants. To make matters worse, discipline in the ranks broke, and Shivington's men began mutilating the bodies. They took the private parts of women and placed them on their hats and saddles, and they went to Denver and had a parade. The people in Denver were cheered, but the people in the nation were horrified about the events that they heard about. When there was a congressional investigation to reprimand Shivington, since he was a brevet civilian, he simply resigned his commission and was beyond military purview. Because Indians were not citizens, they couldn't sue civil cases, so no one paid for the Sand Creek Massacre. Here's some depictions of the Sand Creek Massacre. Howling Wolf's image of the one on the bottom, and another image from a soldier in the top. Well, after the war is over, in the East, it's actually, the terms of it are written by Ely Parker, who was a Seneca who was the aide-de-camp to General Grant. And you see a picture of him there on the left, on the trio. He wrote up Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse in the spring of 1865. But you may not have heard of all of the peace treaties in the West. You see that there were at least 5 major treaties to try to reestablish peace after the horrific things that had occurred in those territories and states. In 1866, the Army has peace treaties at Fort Smith. The following year at Medicine Lodge in 1867 in Kansas. 1868 treaties at Fort Bridger and Fort Laramie and at Fort Sumner. And all of these were to reestablish peace with Indian peoples and also remove them to reservations. In terms of Reconstruction, the West was also divided into military districts. The division of the Atlantic in the East was overseen by Sherman, but the division of the Missouri was overseen by Sheridan. You see the 4 departments there, and I've shown a picture of the Platte Department in the division of Missouri. You'll also notice the very dark shaded portion of this map are Indian lands taken during the 1860 decade. And you can see that it's almost 2/3 of the American West are dispossessed during this decade. This is true of Utah Valley. 1865, the treaty in Spanish Fork will cause the Timpanogos Utes and others to travel to the Ute-Ouray Reservation. The difficulty with that treaty is it was never ratified by the Senate. And therefore, the House never made its allocations. And as a result, we have the Black Hawk War of those who were raiding settlements in order to survive. But you can see that most of the state of Utah was taken during the 1860s. In 1880, that was the Indian land holdings. You can see that it's a very small diminishment in a relatively short amount of time. But the good news is Indian nations are still here. They received American citizenship in 1924. Some veterans had achieved it in 1919 after serving in World War I. And Indians also were able to receive dual citizenship in their own tribal nations after 1970s when a policy of self-determination under President Nixon was put into force. You can see that the historical memory and meanings of the Civil War are still very significant for those tribal people. And it's also reopened the question of federalism in the West. You'll notice that all of the colored area on the map are federally controlled lands. And you see the portion of the states that are dominated by the federal government in the upper small map. You can see that Nevada, Utah, Wyoming, Idaho, 70, 80, 90% of some of these states are controlled by the federal government, and it's created quite a backlash between states' rights and federal rights, similar to some of the issues that were brought about during the Civil War. So as you think about these abolitionist movements, the effect on families, the lantern slides, the echoes of the past, be sure and remember that the American West played a significant role, not only in the prelude to the war, but during the war, and the after effects may have been even as significant as those in the South. Thank you. Great.
You said that most Native Americans decided to join the Confederacy. Why was that?
Well, for one, the Union didn't recruit any Indian troops because they were non-citizens and they didn't want them to enlist. The Confederacy had no such qualms. And as soon as the Union pulled out of Indian Territory in April of 1861, by May, General Pope and others were already there recruiting Indian peoples. And most of those nations came from the South. They had economic and political ties. They owned slaves. They had plantation economies. And so they related in many ways to the South. And even those who didn't want to join the South didn't know whether or not they could leave the North. An example of this is John Ross. There was an outstanding debt of $1 million to the Cherokee Nation from their removal period, and he feared that if they joined the Confederacy, that $1 million would be wiped from the books in the event of a cataclysm. An interesting note is Stand Watie, the Cherokee general who led such a famous raids and guerrilla warfare during the campaigns. He actually surrendered 3 months after General Lee and was the last Confederate general to surrender when he went into Doakes Island in July of 1865. So it was a pretty important event in Indian Territory, and for the most part, most of the nations sided with the South. But all of them are going to pay repercussions with the treaties because when they go in to establish these new treaties in the 1860s, many of those instances wipe out earlier treaties. And so it's a new set of regulations and dialogue. Question?
So what's interesting for me with your presentation is I've heard of all these events, but tying them to the Civil War makes them make more sense. That's sort of what you're hoping to do.
I've never seen this done in a presentation or a book, so I'm glad that you felt that way, Jesse, because I see them as directly related. If the federal troops and the federal forts are not vacated, you don't have depredations on the trail. You don't have the widespread catastrophes, and you don't have the calling up of the militias, which ended up being less friendly toward Indian peoples than the federal government. And so even though there's a series of Indian wars in the late 1860s and 70s, most of those are warriors against soldiers. It's not necessarily against villages, although the Civil War is going to change that too, and the concept of total warfare and winter campaigns will be implemented by Sheridan, who's now in charge of the division of the Missouri. And so in a battle like Washita or Washita in 1868, George Armstrong Custer will attack the village in November, knowing that the horses are the weakest. They're along rivers and streams where there's wood and water, and that they wouldn't be able to flee or get away. And so it's gonna change things. Not only that, think of the technologies and strategies that are devised in the war. Breech-loading rifles, for instance, howitzers, cannon, these strategies I mentioned. So there's a whole number of ramifications both during the war and after. And I should mention that in 1868, the Navajo are able to sign a treaty. Barboncito, the great orator, is able to work out a deal, and they return to the Navajo reservation, which today is the largest reservation in the United States. But instead of having 50 different groups going a long walk, they go back as a united nation of 8,000 people. And so it brought them together in ways that maybe some other things couldn't have done. Great question. Other thoughts? Yes?
What was the motive behind going up against the Navajos?
It's complicated, but there's just an effort to divest Indians of their land base, either through ethnic cleansing or other ways, to diminish their ability to resist and to open up lands. Look at it this way: in the 1862 Congress, when the southern states have seceded, there's a rash of policies that are put through as bills. the transportation and communication routes, establishing the Transcontinental Railroad, the Homestead Act of 1862, the Morrill Land Grant Act, opening up tracts of land for education. You can go down the list. There are a number of different things that the federal government does in the 1860s to try to encourage people to travel to the West, new American settlers. And so one of the efforts is to open up those lands by removing the Indian people that lived there. So that would be one response to that. And once the Indians are removed to reservations, then there's the notion that to kill the Indian and save the man, you had to send the children to boarding schools to teach them English and Christianity, gender-specific working roles. And by doing so, the children could incorporate into the American society. And then in terms of land adjustment, just like slaves and sharecropping and the 40 acres of a mule in the South were kind of a redistribution that ended up not being carried out. In the West, it was. And Indians face allotment during the 1880s and 90s, and that too will further divest them of the reservations that they had even in the 1870s and 80s. So it's an ongoing struggle. Other thoughts, comments, rebuttals? Yes?
I know if you go through the War of the Rebellion records, you see all of the records dealing with Sand Creek and the Barrier Massacre. How did the military officials in the East regard these various depredations against the Indians?
It depended. Sometimes they lauded the actions. For example, when Connor takes out his vengeance on Bear Hunter's group, he actually receives a promotion and becomes a general. And then eventually he'll go out onto the plains and fight Plains Indians. So in that case, he's rewarded for this. In the Sand Creek incident, turns the tide the other way, and there's a backlash against that because of the mutilations and the things that occurred after the battle, not necessarily the battle itself. And so that's gonna play a big role too, is how the press and media followed and covered the story. So it just varied. In the Navajo state, Carleton is replaced in 1866, ending the removal period of the Navajo. He's replaced by a new person, and then within 2 years they have the peace treaty and they return. So you can see that there's some back and forth. And the Agent Wangcoop, who was replaced so that Sand Creek could occur, he's sent back to Fort Lyon just a few months after the incident, and he's furious because this would have never happened under his watch. And unfortunately for Black Kettle, it wasn't over. After his village moves to Indian Territory in the 1860s, it'll be his village that George Armstrong Custer attacks in November, almost 4 years to the day of 1868 in the Battle of the Washita. And in that one, he and his wife and family are all killed. All right, thank you for being an attentive audience. It's been great. I know it's kind of a somber topic, but war is hell. So.
Another round of applause.